Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is SQOPE. The United States finds itself isolated on the world stage. Trump's decision to officially recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory has angered even close allies such as Britain and France. At the UN Security Council, 14 out of the 15 member states spoke out against this move. They said international law and resolutions on the illegal Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights must be respected. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're now joined by Dr. Andrea Stoyan-Karadeli, who is an independent researcher. She is based in Istanbul in Turkey, and she's joining us from Istanbul right now via Skype. We're also joined by Ahmed Jamal Al-Ahmed, who is a consultant in strategic intelligence and U.S., Middle East, North Africa geopolitics. He is joining us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. And we're also joined by Dr. Hassan Hafez, who is a teaching fellow in Middle East politics at King's College in London. He is joining us from London via Skype. Thank you all for joining us. If I may, I'd like to start with you, Ahmed. What do you make of the U.S. move vis-a-vis the occupied Golan Heights?
Well, to take it in a nutshell, I think this is very symbolic of the Trump administration and I want to say the evangelical establishment that's supporting him. And this is what they've been calling for a while now, and it's just come to light since the Trump administration has come to power. And the outrage you see from the rest of the world is, I mean, if you really want to showcase the outrage, you would have some kind of diplomatic relations sanctions. But this is par for the course for the Trump admin and their allies. I'm not surprised at all.
But to be fair, Ahmed, to be fair to America's allies, even the likes of Britain and France spoke out against this move at the UN. That's quite a strong stance, isn't it, on their part?
It depends on how you define strong. I mean, they also had a stance against the Israelis when they moved into Jerusalem and took, the U.S. embassy. So it depends on how you define strong. To me, strong is not simply offering a resolution or attempting to offer a resolution against the UN Security Council. To me, in practicality, you need to, I wouldn't say punish in terms of any kind of economic sanctions, but more diplomatic to show that there are consequences for these violations and consistent violations since before 1967. So I think it's a weak response, but it's typical and standard of the world order we are in.
Interesting. Andrea, do you agree with that? Do you think that the world will sort of just accept this because the U.S. made the decision?
Definitely, like most of the states would be against U.S. decision. But what we need to understand actually here is the fact that the decision itself in practice has no real meaning, as in it's not going to change anything really in the territory. It's more of a symbolism that we have to think about when it comes to the U.S. decision and U.S. steps towards Israel. And when we talk about symbolism, we have to think about two dimensions. Firstly, we should look at the plan that U.S. had so far since the Trump administration came into power regards Israel. And there has been important steps so far, and one of them was moving the embassy, the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, which means the confirmation that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, according to Trump's administration. Secondly, it's symbolism regarding what's going to happen next and declaring actually against something that has been stated by the United Nations so far since 1967, the fact that that land was not annexed, is not legal to be annexed to Israel. It's coming against its own states because U.S. backed those declarations every single step. Secondly, there's something else as well, is the timing. Why now? Why is U.S. taking such a step now? And if we look at internal politics and Israel internal politics, we can see that we have the elections coming up on the 9th of April. So Trump's decision regarding the Golan Heights is also a show of support to Netanyahu.
Indeed.
And that's also very important. And that's another dimension that we need to look at.
Indeed.
So
Okay, let me just pick up on some of the points you've made there, Andrea, if you allow me. I want to put that to Hassan. Andrea made their point about symbolism because, you know, it's interesting. While the U.S. says they recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, they at the same time have said the UN peacekeeping mission in that buffer zone should remain in place. That's sort of a mixed message, isn't it, Hassan?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've seen those mixed messages, namely from the United States past administrations and current ones for some time now. I think it's important to take into context, and I do concur with Dr. Andrea's point that this position is more symbolic than anything else, that just to take into account that the United Nations Security Council did actually pass a resolution in December 1981 that called Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights as null and void and without any legal effect. So that's been certified by the United Nations and remains their position up until now. Now, the question is, would this actually change given the US government's newfound position on this? Well, in truth be told, as I concur with the other speakers, I would highly doubt this. And so, as we've alluded to before, this latest move cannot be seen outside the context, of course, of upcoming Israeli elections. Benjamin Netanyahu, now the longest-serving Israeli PM and trying to go for another term in office. Yeah. But more broadly, which hasn't been mentioned, I think this is all more part and parcel of one of the signature policies of this new Trump administration, which is all being done and executed in the name, more broadly, of containing Iran, or supposedly containing Iran's malign influence, with the ultimate aim of course, instigating regime collapse, not specifically regime change, but regime collapse. So the heavily imposed sanctions on Tehran and trying to curb some of their activities, which Israel for a long time now has perceived as an existential threat. But if I can just mention as well, if the last decade and a half is anything to go by, arguing that Iran's supposed influence in the region has all been, it's important to know, it's all been acquired in a way inadvertently by default, whether it's the implications of the US occupation in Iraq, all the way until today with the premeditated, effectively inhumane starvation campaign in Yemen, all contribute to this idea of supposed Iranian influence. So, you know, this kind of diplomatic posturing, you know, acknowledging US position on the annexation.
I'm glad you brought up Iran, Ahmed, because, pardon me, Hassan, because I wanted to, in fact, put that point, Hassan, to Ahmed. Ahmed, what do you make of the Iran angle on all this? Because as Hassan there correctly pointed out, Ahmed, US officials and even Israeli officials have mentioned the threat of Iran closer to Israel now because of the Golan Heights and Iran's presence on the ground there in Syria. Is that a fair point, at least from their point of view, do you think?
Again, it comes down to how you define these terms. A threat, how are we defining threat? Iran actually is not a military threat to Israel. It's not an economic threat. Yes, it can worry Israel and its allies, mainly the U.S. And, of course, Saudi, through Hezbollah, and again, its actions and activity in Yemen, and maybe sporadically in Bahrain and some of the Gulf countries. But strategically, Iran is not, long-term, it may be a threat, but short-term now, I don't think Iran can pose such a threat, economically speaking. It can't sustain any of its military activities for too long. I mean, go back to what Dr. Hassan was saying.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to get Andrea in on this as well. And Andrea, I wanted to ask you because from the Israeli and American point of view, Andrea, they would see again Iranian presence, at least publicly. That's what their justification, in part at least, for this recognition of the Golan Heights seemingly is largely based on Iranian presence on the ground in Syria. Is that just for public show, Andrea, or do you think that there is some genuine concern there?
kind of has been the narrative so far, and definitely Iran is a player on the ground. But if we look, especially in this context, the investment done by Iran is rather symbolic than material. And I do agree with Dr. Ahmad on this, as in Iran doesn't really represent a threat to Israel, neither economically nor military on its own. However, when it comes to the triangle that we have there, and that's Iran, Syria, Russia, and the support that has been given by Russia and Iran towards Syria during the Syrian civil war, towards the Syrian government, towards Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war since 2011, we would have a more complex picture, and that's what we will need to look at. Yes, of course, indeed, Iran has been using the Syrian military and terrorist groups such as Hezbollah as proxies against Israel. And yes, of course, Syria and the Syrian territory is definitely a buffer zone for Iran as well when it comes to Israel. However, I do repeat the fact that Iran on its own does not really represent a threat to Israel, and the narrative that is put on by the US and Israel does not really stand.
Okay, time now for a very short break, viewers. I'm going to ask Ahmed and Hassan to stay with us. We're going to continue this conversation after this break. Please stay with us. All right, viewers, we're back now with Andrea, Ahmed, and Hassan, continuing our conversation here about the U.S. decision to recognize the occupied Golan Heights as Israeli territory. And now, Hassan, before going to the break, Andrea there mentioned obviously the perceived threat of Iran. But then I wonder, the other aspect to all of this, even if we may call this a symbolic move, is that of any deal of the century, as the U.S. has spoken about, to resolve the situation in Palestine. What do you make of that? What kind of an effect does this move on Jerusalem, and then now on the Golan Heights, have on any possible peace deal?
Yes, well, I think it's important to actually take stock of that point you just mentioned. As we mentioned, with this, the new legacy of the Trump administration, including the decision to relocate the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, we're starting to see the beginnings of a more brazen, more uncompromising approach by the U.S. government to now openly, in effect, do away with what was, in reality, this ongoing facade of somehow wanting to uphold a two-state solution and restart the peace process. I think Donald Trump has really gone out of his way now, given these last two, let's call them symbolic moves, to really do away with this. I think also as well, but what the United States needs to, and linked to this, I should say, is of course the scrapping of the JCPOA, so the nuclear deal with Iran, which in correspondence with this as well, we're starting to see a growing disparity or disconnect in relation to the United States' new position and the international community, and specifically old-found allies such as the EU. So we're starting to see that different positions here. One of unilateralism on Israel, on the United States part, and one with European partners who are wanting to engage, looking to find a way out through diplomatic means, particularly vis-a-vis Iran. But one thing I did want to mention as well, which I think from a domestic perspective in the US, these moves are only going to hinder kind of Israeli perception as a whole, because one of the growing problems, we just had AIPAC's conference last week, one of the growing problems now isn't necessarily what takes place in the Middle East, but actually domestic audiences' perceptions. Yes. So we're starting to see this, what was assumed to be a given before, bipartisan support for the Israeli state is now starting to be questioned. And we're starting to see this growing disconnect, particularly in the Democrat Party, between its constituency and the traditional.
And that's a very good point, Hassan, because I think that's a valid bring up, Ahmad. We did recently see with that AIPAC conference, as Hassan there mentioned, some Democrat presidential nominees or candidates, pardon me, for the 2020 elections did not attend the AIPAC conference this time around. Do you think that the tide is slowly turning?
It's not only slowly turning. I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, you have, again, like Dr. Hassan pointed out, there is a generational divide that is occurring in the U.S., particularly among young Jews and whose parents may have been Zionist inclined, and they don't see their affiliation with Israel based on religion or based on any or any other social affiliation. They actually believe in principles. They actually believe in human rights. So they're holding their government, which is the United States, and at the same time, the Israeli counterparts to account. And let me go back to a specific item in regards to the internal domestic affairs of Israel. Mm-hmm. The more Israel society and the more the government becomes more democratic in terms of giving more equal rights to the Palestinian, to all its citizens, mm-hmm. the more likely the Israeli government will have more inclusiveness and more Palestinians will take part. And over time, it is inevitable that Palestinians will take part and will become a majority in the Israeli government. I mean, we're talking generations here. This is inevitable. I mean, if you look over the course of civilization and history, time is on the side of the Palestinians, not on the Israeli side.
I'm going to push you on that point you just made there, Ahmed, because I'm going to just take a bit more to get to Andrea. But Ahmed, to be fair, though, if you look at Israeli society right now, it seems increasingly more right-wing and even, I guess it can be argued, even extremist in some regards. How will Palestinians find their place within such a society?
So the fact that they're becoming more extremist and more right-wing, and I mean, they're totally on the opposite end of the spectrum. There have been more calls now, more criticism, and more justified criticisms from people who they considered and took for granted their support in the U.S. and the European allies. So because of this extreme right-wing turn in this short period of time, that is what's putting pressure on Israeli society to actually change. There have been calls for Netanyahu to stop these race baiting, to stop provocations and inciting violence, and this over time will have an effect on Israel. BDS is taking a massive toll on Israel economically, politically, diplomatically, and again, I agree with Dr. Hassan. Like the pressure, a lot of pressure is going to change, but it's going to come from the U.S. side because of this generational divide. With the old guard fading away, eventually they'll have to fade away. You know, Schumer and Pelosi and a new guard will take over, and this is the generation of Ocasio-Cortez, Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, O'Rourke. You know, so there is something to look forward to here, I believe.
Okay. Andrea, do you agree on that point? It is now a question of the tide turning, for example, in the United States, which obviously, in this case of Israel/Palestine, or at least resolving that issue, holds the cards really at this point in time. Do you think that, A, the factor of American Jews to begin with, as Hassan there mentioned, and secondly, just American society as a whole, that entire opinion, and their entire opinion, pardon me, on Israel is changing?
I do believe that when it comes to the change of the generations and the new generation that's coming up and kind of stands not against, but kind of the opposite side to the old generation. I think this is a phenomenon that we witness not just in the US, but around the globe. And there have been changes that have been witnessed so far, different dimensions. However, when it comes to the Jewish population, the Jewish community in the US, and the new generation within the Jewish community, we cannot really classify and put everyone in one group, as in this new Jewish generation is definitely different than the old one and is going to be more democratic, or is going to stand towards more democratic moves when it comes to Israel's policies and Israel's policies towards Palestine. I think there is much more research that should be done towards this. And I believe that a way of kind of compromising these two generations and having them see the complex image, not just the own interests, the personal interests into this issue, but more of the complex picture and the fact that every single move kind of gets a domino reaction that they need to take into account. I think that's what the new generation and the old one needs to understand.
Okay, Hassan, one of the real-world consequences, which many people would argue that Donald Trump does not often take into account when he's making his rash decisions. But a real-world consequence, for example, would be that, and it's already been seen, is that Lebanon, for example, would look at the situation with alarm, because Israel currently occupies Lebanese territories, such as the Sheba Farms and others, and it's been occupying those territories since at least 1981. Do you think that this has then set a precedent where Israel can annex a territory, hold on to that territory for years, and then officially the world will at some point in time just give in and say, fine, it's yours?
Well, it appears to be the case that, as you mentioned, there is a historical precedent there that it's one thing having the international community and UN resolutions condemning such moves. But I just think there's a real sense of irony here that for some years now, the US, both this administration and the last one, has been, maybe more so with the Obama administration, was condemning Moscow for its annexation of the Crimea from eastern Ukraine. But again, this sense of carte blanche and just given impunity towards Israel, I think there's going to come a point, as we noted with our last point about different sentiments and attitudes towards Israel now in the Western Hemisphere. Something's got to give. I think in terms of Lebanese security, of course, this is going to raise alarm just as much as it is for Syrian security, as well, as we see that the conflict in Syria is coming towards an end of sorts. We're still yet to see what the Syrian position would be. Now, back in 2010, I should note that there were secret backroom talks between Israel and Damascus in a way of actually trying to settle this issue around the Golan Heights. But of course, with the onset of the civil war that took place after 2011, that's of course taken a back turn. And I think Israel has really taken advantage of a quite harrowing situation in the fallout of what's taken place in Syria, while all eyes are focused on what's taken place. I think they're trying to take advantage of a situation here. I mean, it's important to note as well, just demographically speaking, that there are still some 25,000 Druze Arabs who regard themselves as Syrian citizens first and foremost, still residing in the Golan Heights. But you do have now some 20,000, and this number is increasing, Jewish settlers, and the number of settlement expansion is increasing within the Golan Heights. So this ongoing issue of settlement expansion isn't going to go anywhere anytime soon. No.
Ahmed, you're with Ahmed. So give us the point of view from Lebanon's perspective on this. I imagine, I've read a bit that Michel Aoun has spoken about, not alarm, I would say, but he has obviously understood that this is a precedent that is being set, where first we had Jerusalem, then we had Golan Heights, and what's to say that tomorrow it may not be Sheba Farms or these other areas that Israel occupies, which are Lebanese.
Now, on the reality on the ground is that what Israel and the U.S. did with the Golan Heights, they cannot do in the south, because there is, speaking of Hezbollah has the leadership will to actually take on Israel and react. And we have to understand Hezbollah's context with regards to Israel. Hezbollah is always reactive in defensive ventures against Israel. Whenever Israel takes action, Hezbollah reacts, either tit for tat or, and it takes time. Hezbollah sometimes doesn't react immediately. It may take a year or so, but Israel knows, strategically speaking, its military leadership knows that it cannot take the Sheba Farms like they did with the Golan Heights, because there will be a reaction that Hezbollah will take. And it will actually serve to unite the Lebanese people, even though there are sectarian issues we have here. But this will unite the Lebanese people. It will involve the Lebanese army, and it will serve to bolster Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, strengthen them politically, and they will be even more of a regional force than they are now. So it will be a strategic mistake for Israel to even attempt or even discuss something like this. Okay. And unfortunately, the Trump administration is not a strategic player. They're more reaction and shooting from the hip. But I don't think Israel will make that mistake. They know they can get away with it with Syria because There have been so many instances where Israel has violated Syrian sovereignty, airspace, and incursions, and Syria has done nothing. But with Hezbollah, there will be retaliation, and Israel knows that.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final word. The clock has gotten the best, of course. We appreciate all of our guests and their time, of course, and insight and analysis. Let me thank them from the end there. We were speaking to Mr. Ahmed Jamad Ahmed, who is a consultant in strategic intelligence and U.S., Middle Eastern, North African geopolitics. He was speaking to us from the Lebanese capital, Beirut. We were also joined by Dr. Andrea Soyan Karadeli, who is an independent researcher. She was speaking to us from Istanbul in Turkey. And we were also joined by Dr. Hassan Hafid, who is a teaching fellow in Middle East politics at King's College in London, and he was speaking to us from London via Skype. Now, viewers, as all of our guests there mentioned, there are a number of facets to this Golan Heights issue. Of course, it is symbolic because there are mixed messages coming out of the U.S. itself as well, with the U.S. still wanting the UN peacekeeping mission to remain in that area. However, it does seemingly find itself isolated, but we'll have to see if the international community moves beyond just condemnations and actually takes action to ensure that this U.S. decision is not implemented necessarily on the ground. A lot of aspects vis-a-vis the precedent as well that is being set at this point. Jerusalem, Golan Heights. What is the next step then in this case with an ever more right-wing Israeli society and voting base? A lot of aspects and a lot of developments still to come, no doubt, in that region. We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope, but stay with us. We'll be back with our next segment after this break. Viewers, thank you for staying with us here in Scope. U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened that all options are on the table when it comes to ensuring Russian troops leave Venezuela. Some now see Venezuela as the latest front in the Cold War between the two nations. Russia maintains that American interference in Venezuela is hypocritical, while the United States itself remains obsessed about interference in its own elections. The U.S. insists it is only seeking to restore democracy and the rights and freedoms of Venezuelans usurped by the Maduro government. To discuss that further, we're joined now by Professor Zatko Hajitaric, who is an assistant professor at the American University in the Emirates. He's joining us now from Dubai. Zatko, thanks for joining us here in Scope. What do you make, Zatko, of the threat, essentially, of Donald Trump that all options are on the table when it comes to those Russian troops' arrival in Venezuela?
Thank you for the invitation first. Well, I would say that new great power game is arising and that obviously all options are on the table. What I find interesting about the moves that Donald Trump and the American administration are making is that they are actually, in my view, returning to the old Monroe Doctrine of withdrawing into the Western Hemisphere. So in that context, they probably need Venezuela as an oil resource-rich country, as something which would replace the Middle East if the U.S. truly withdraws from that part of the world as its sphere of interest.
Interesting. Zatko, I wonder, John Bolton, I believe it was, said that while Russia sends, military planes and military officials to Venezuela, the United States is sending humanitarian aid into Venezuela. What do you make of that discrepancy and that vast difference in the approach between the two countries to Venezuela?
Well, obviously, they are playing their game. I mean, we cannot really say that the U.S. is limited only to humanitarian aid. They are doing various things to speed up the process of replacement of the current President Maduro with his opponent. But on the other hand, Russia is trying to penetrate into the American sphere of interest, and I see that as a kind of counterbalance for what the U.S. has been doing for years in Ukraine. I see that Russia is probably trying to send a message which is rather of a tactical nature, that they can do that they can also penetrate into America's so-called natural sphere of interest. So I wouldn't say that they are really different in terms of the roles they play. It is just a great powers game as we used to know it from the Cold War. It is just that now means have changed slightly. obviously all the options are open, and it is possible to expect many shifts which might take place if the tensions really grow.
You know, at this point, it seems, Zatko, that we are at pass, aren't we, when it comes to Venezuela? Maduro is still holding on to power. Guaido, even though he has now been barred by the Maduro government from public office for 15 years, is saying that, you know what, I'm still here too, and I'm the legitimate president. Do you think Russia is betting on the fact that obviously Maduro will weather this out? This is sort of risky for Russia, isn't it?
I don't see that as an authentic move. As I said, I see it as a symbolic gesture, just to demonstrate their own power, or the power to project their own power into America's sphere of interest. That's something which I wouldn't really assign so much value, because Russia is rather interested in, well, containing the pressures elsewhere, namely in Ukraine first, and some other places. I don't really see Russia as powerful enough as to really project its power into other parts of the world. It is rather a symbolic message as far as I can see that. As for Maduro, I don't really see a way for him to survive if the U.S. has really decided for him to be replaced. That's something which will take time perhaps, but I really don't see a real way for Russia to actually support him or preserve him. It is not Syria. It is not the same story where they managed to preserve Assad, but we should remember that the U.S. invited Russia there, and that Russia got a green light to actually preserve the Syrian government.
Okay, I wanted to add, if you allow me, Zatko, another voice to this conversation. I do apologize for interrupting you there. We're now joined by Mr. Jose Chalhoub, who is a political risk consultant, and he's joining us now from the Venezuelan capital, Caracas. Jose, we appreciate your time this morning there in Caracas. Jose, tell us about the feeling in Venezuela itself at this point in time, with the fact that Donald Trump has given this threat to Russia, essentially saying all options are on the table for the U.S. to, remove Russian troops from that country.
I don't really see having Russia being positioned here in the country for a long time. They are only worried about their investments here. And since Chavez came to power with the arrival of the Bolivarian Revolution, and many deals in the fields of oil, energy, and arms purchases from Venezuela to Russia have been established, and many debts have been carried out from the Venezuelan government, first under Chavez and now under Maduro. And yes, around $20 billion, around between 20 and 30 billion dollars. It's the amount of the current debt from Caracas to Moscow, and the Kremlin is really worried about that. So the concern from the Kremlin and President Putin is pragmatic, and they are worried about their investments. And geopolitically speaking, and geostrategically speaking, and in terms of logistics, I see that for Moscow, Caracas is not really relevant, and especially in terms of Maduro's own survival power. So I don't really see Moscow being completely or massively positioned here as it was in Syria, for example.
So, okay, let me put that point to the Zatko as well. Zatko, do you think that this is a lot to do with the fact that Moscow does genuinely have a lot of investments and a stake, really, in Venezuela?
Well, they probably do have investments. It is just a matter of geopolitics, I would say. They cannot simply preserve the current government with 100 troops or with anything they invest there. And as I said, I really do think that it is a rather symbolic gesture to demonstrate that that Russia is back in terms of its global power, in terms of its global reach. I don't really see that as something that is going to last. Russia cannot really play the role in the Western Hemisphere, does not have power for that. So regardless of the presence of Russian capital, which is present everywhere, you will find it in most parts of Europe. So they are not going to conquer Europe because of that. So I don't really see Russian capital as something that is going to play a role. I see it as a strategic issue which has something to do with the ability of Russia to project its military power to Venezuela, and I see that as quite impossible.
Let me then take this issue of Russia versus U.S. global, if I may, for a moment. You've already mentioned Ukraine. We can obviously talk about Syria as well, Zatko, and other such disagreements which exist between these two powers worldwide. It seems with every disagreement, Zatko, that the possibility of some form of confrontation becomes ever more real, doesn't it?
Well, I agree. I mean, there are a couple of critical hotspots in the world. If you ask me to name them as those which are the most likely to trigger some serious consequences, I would rather say that that's the rise of the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, rather than what is happening in Venezuela. In my view, that might be the trigger of a serious crisis, because if they enter into an armed conflict, you will certainly have the U.S. on the Saudi side and Moscow on the Iranian side, and then we have a very serious situation. So obviously, Russia is trying to state that they have power to play a game with the U.S., but on the other hand, I think that the U.S. General strategy has changed. I have mentioned the return to the Monroe Doctrine. I really see it like that. I see that the U.S. is withdrawing from multilateral institutions in which the U.S. participated in the 20th century, including NATO, not just the UN, withdrawing from multilateral treaties and so on, trying to reestablish bilateral relations with many countries and so on. So it looks like a major geopolitical shift, which in my view reminds me very much of a possibility of return to the Monroe Doctrine of controlling the Western Hemisphere and withdrawing from the role of the global policeman, as it used to be called. In the first place, withdrawing from the Middle East. I think that the U.S. withdrawal from Syria is the first sign of that, and that the fact that tensions are not rising in Ukraine also testifies to the fact that the U.S. is gradually giving it up as an idea of putting it under their control next to Russia. So it seems to me that the U.S. has reassessed its own powers, its potentials again, and that they do not see, they have probably realized that they have been overstretched over these last couple of decades, and that they have to make a major shift. Perhaps it looks like that. Perhaps it's not going to happen with some other administration, but what is happening at the moment with the Trump administration and the people who are backing it, it seems as if they are reassessing their potentials and that they are moving towards the Western Hemisphere rather than playing the role they used to have.
Okay, so Zatko, I wonder though, when we're talking about, if we may for a moment look at just Russia's foreign policies and who it supports around the world, if we're talking about Syria, the argument would be that why would Russia stand by who many people around the world will argue would be a dictator, such as Bashar al-Assad? Then the same argument would be used in some ways about Nicolas Maduro. Why would Russia stand by Nicolas Maduro, who, won an election which was, which there were many arguments about and disagreements about whether that was really free and fair. And even when it came to Ukraine, many people criticize how that entire annexation of Crimea occurred, etc. What do you make of the Russian track record and the American criticism, as well as Western criticism of it?
Well, obviously, they are not picky about who they support. They are trying to project their geopolitical influence, and they are choosing the regimes which are ready to be their allies. And I have to remind you that in the Cold War, it was normal for both blocs to support dictators of the left side or of the right option. So I see it as a typical great power game. I don't see any kind of, ethics in contemporary international relations, in the sense that we should wonder why someone supports dictators, why someone supports this or that. Obviously, even the Cold War, as nasty as it used to be, looks like a fairy tale compared to the current global relations, in which there are no rules, no scruples, and countries which aspire to have a real international power, a real geopolitical reach, they do not choose the allies. They are just projecting their power wherever they can.
Okay, so talking about allies, let me bring in Jose once again. Leave is back with us. Jose, if you can hear me clearly, I wanted to know, Jose, about the feeling in Venezuela about Guaido being barred from public office for 15 years. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yes, about Guaido being barred from public office for 15 years. That was a decision taken by the National Comptroller. Well, I mean, now nobody from the opposition recognizes this National Comptroller as a legitimate comptroller. So, and this one Guaido just declared that he has this decision, and also from the United States, which declared that this decision was ridiculous, and I don't think Guaido will step down as president of the National Assembly as an interim president. So and in the coming weeks, this will create a further political crisis of governance between two powers, or two presumed powers, which they both are declaring themselves like who's more legitimate than who. So it'll at the end of the day, it'll be more critical for the people and for the whole country. Okay,
so Jose, just as a final thought then, as we're concluding this segment, tell us about what your thoughts are about the Russian role at this point. What are the Venezuelan people thinking about the fact that these Russian planes have come into the country, that military officials from Russia are in Venezuela? What are Venezuelans thinking about that?
Yes, I understood your point. Well, in two ideas. First of all, Venezuelan people historically have been more pro-U.S., pro-Western attitudes. We have been really heavily influenced by pop culture from the U.S. and all that, baseball, many U.S. culture things. And now that we are in the middle of this geopolitical game between Russia and the U.S. and China, and we haven't been used to this type of political tricks and games and all that. Okay. And also, the traditional Venezuelan people don't have like a opinion about like a Russian government, for example. Okay, so we are not really comfortable with the recent arrivals of Russian soldiers, for example, to Caracas, and there have been many speculations about that. Hopefully for the best. This won't lead to any escalation of conflicts and tensions between the U.S. and Russia, for example.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final point, but of course we appreciate both of our guests and their time and insight. We're going to say thank you to Mr. Jose Chalhoub, who's a political risk consultant. He was speaking to us from Caracas in Venezuela. We were also joined by Professor Zatko Hajdadic, who is an assistant professor at the American University in the Emirates. He was speaking to us from Dubai. Viewers, as both of our guests are mentioned, when it comes to this threat that Donald Trump has put forth against Russia, about removing its troops from Venezuela now that those Russian troops have arrived in 2 planes, along with a number of military officials, is one that proves again another front has opened in the continuing Cold War around the world between these 2 powers. We can talk about Syria, we can talk about Ukraine, and even other parts of the world where NATO, of course, expansionism is also occurring in Europe towards Russian borders. We'll keep a very close eye on the tensions between those 2 powers here in SQOPE. Ravin Roqar Rizvi, thanks for watching.